Hi everyone. Hi everyone. So if you can come forward, because the voice is dispersing, so you might not be able to hear it, so it's best that we come forward. Thank you so much. So up next we have Sid, who is a Sensei at OSINT Dojo. Sensei is a certified cybercrime investigator that specializes in leveraging open source intelligence for tracking and unmasking online targets. So he's going to be speaking about pretty good pivot, examining the PGP key pair creation habits of darknet vendors. Now I'm going to give it to him. He's going to speak more about his topic and what he does. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, you guys able to hear me? A little bit better? All right, cool. So before I get started, I just want a quick show of hands. How many people here are familiar with pretty good privacy or PGP keys? Oh wow, yeah, way more than I expected. That's great. Has anyone actually used PGP keys as part of an investigation or some kind of reconnaissance before? Show of hands again. A couple. Okay. That makes this a whole lot easier for me. So when it comes to OSINT investigations, me personally, PGP keys are one of my favorite pivot points. Now part of this is because I feel like PGP keys are kind of neglected. They're often overlooked. And at the same time, when it comes to darknet vendors, these things are incredibly common. You're going to find yourself tripping over them very quickly. And so my hope is that by the end of this presentation, you have a little bit of an idea of, first off, why I like them so much. But also, I hope that you learn a couple tricks and maybe a few techniques on how you can pivot off of these should you run across one in a future investigation. So before we get into the fun part, a little bit about me. So I'm Sin. I also go by Sinwindie on most social media sites, if you're into that sort of thing. And I'm a certified cybercrime investigator. I have over 10 years of experience in open source intelligence, and I've held roles both within the federal government, as well as more recently within the private sector. Now most of these roles have involved mostly using OSINT for tracking and unmasking different bad actors. I also run the OSINT Dojo, which maintains free resources and kind of different challenges for those who are new to the field, and acts to sort of gamify, so you can kind of learn new skills and then earn some digital badges as well. So if you're new to OSINT, you're sitting these talks this weekend, you want to figure out how to get started, I recommend going and checking that out when you have a chance. So this is going to be our agenda. We're going to start off with a real high-level background on pretty good privacy, which apparently a lot of you already know, which makes this easy. And then we're going to look at how darknet vendors are going to leverage it, specifically for the purpose of encryption. We're also going to look at what that means for us as OSINT investigators. After that, we're going to get to the main part of our case study, which is going to be kind of the bulk of the presentation. And so with this, we're going to look at how the case study was actually carried out, some high-level trends that I observed in this case study, as well as take a look at a couple examples of some different vendors that had some, we'll just say, less than stellar OPSEC. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up with some closing thoughts, and then we'll save some time at the end in case we have any questions. Are you all able to hear me okay back there? Is that, all right, you shake one, yes and no, okay. Half-half. So first off, what is pretty good privacy? Well, at just like a super high level, PGP is a method for securing files and messages using encryption. Now obviously, this is the reason darknet vendors are going to love it, right? It helps them encrypt their messaging. Now, to do this, PGP leverages two keys. You have one public key, and then you have a private key. And these keys are going to work together. Now that public key, you're going to share that with other users. That's why we call it the public key. And so that's going to allow them to encrypt things that they're going to send to you. Whereas that private key, that's going to be kept private to the owner, and that's the only thing that allows you to then go and decrypt what was encrypted using that public key. Now likewise, messages can also be signed with that private key, whereas the public key can then be used to then go and verify those signatures. So like I said, they kind of work together. So let's put this in perspective by looking at how a darknet vendor and a potential buyer would leverage this on a darknet market, specifically for encryption. So our example here, we have our vendor on the left, which you know they're on the up and up, right? They got that nice snazzy suit and tie. And then we have our buyer here on the right. Now, both users at this point have created their own PGP key pairs. Now, typically when a vendor opens up shop on a new market, one of the first things they do after they set up their profile is they're going to make their public key available for everyone else to acquire. This allows any potential buyer to actually get that public key, so that when they reach out to that to that vendor for the first time, that first message is not unencrypted. And so as you can see in our example here, our buyer's done just that. He's gone and acquired the vendor's public key. And so to initiate correspondence, the buyer is then going to draft their initial message to our vendor, and with it, they're going to include their own public key. The buyer is then going to use the vendor's public key to encrypt everything before sending it off to our vendor. Now at this point, after receiving this message, the vendor is going to use their private key to then decrypt everything, and then in that process, we'll obtain the clear text message as well as the buyer's public key. And so now at this point, they've exchanged their public keys, they can continue to send encrypted messages back and forth, and at no point during this process were any messages sent in clear text. And so some of you might be wondering then, why do we care about PGP as investigators when all the messages are encrypted? Well, our target's not the actual messages. We're going to be looking to exploit the public keys. And so when a user creates a new PGP key pair, they have the option to enter additional information. Optional being the keyword there. And so you can add in a name, a username, or if you want, you can also add an email address. Now keep in mind, there's nothing that says anything you enter in here has to be any real information. You can put pretty much whatever you want. You can also leave some of this blank. There's nobody checking your ID to make sure that what you put in here matches up. And so in our example here, I'm creating a new key pair with a fake name as well as a fake email address. Now, after creating this, I can then go on and export my public key and make it publicly available for anyone else to access, just like we saw in our vendor example. Keep in mind though, anyone who obtains my public key, they can use it for sending me encrypted messages, but they can also actually go back and actually obtain all the information that I put in when I generated my PGP key pair. So this is the information we're going to be looking at as part of our investigations. Now, keep in mind, nothing I've told you at this point is any kind of secret. Federal law enforcement have arrested darknet vendors in the past, in part because of the very information they put when they made their PGP key pair. And as with any other kind of behavior that leads to a user's arrest, this kind of stuff is studied, recommendations are made. How do we minimize these risks as vendors? And those recommendations find their way around the rest of the darknet community. And so one recommendation I've seen quite a few times is to generate a unique PGP key pair for every profile you have on darknet markets. And the reasoning they gave behind this is, well, law enforcement can use your public key to link your profiles together. And that's true. That's something you can do. But I'm not really fond of this particular recommendation in the sense that, honestly, a lot of these vendors, especially the more notable ones, the larger ones, they just use the same username as they go from market to market. And so you don't need to use a PGP key pair in order to link them together. A lot of the other recommendations I see, though, tend to involve more so the actual information that's entered during the key pair creation process. Particularly the email address. That seems to be the big one. There's all kinds of opinions on what you should or should not put here. Now, as far as I'm concerned, from an OPSEC perspective, best case scenario is leave it blank. Don't put anything in here in the first place. If you don't put anything in here, and I or some other kind of investigator get access to your public key, then there's nothing for us to pivot off of, right? It's a dead end. But if for whatever reason you insist on putting an email here, maybe you want to give potential buyers a way to reach out to you, if the market goes down, something like that. If you're going to do that, at the very least, don't use a ClearNet email address. After all, law enforcement very easily can send them a legal process, and well, they're going to get your information that way. It's also probably a better idea to probably use a provider that encrypts everything by default. Now, even if they claim to do this, it doesn't hurt to go ahead and use PGP, just in case. You don't want to find out a couple months down the road that they're not actually encrypting everything like they say they are. And if you're going to ignore all the recommendations that I have up here, probably the one thing you should not do under any circumstances is you should never use your personal email to make your vendor PGP key. You don't want to use the same email that you've used for the last 15 years that at this point is just inherently tied to your real world identity, right? That's a bad idea. And so I feel like these are all pretty reasonable recommendations, right? None of these are too technically difficult for us to implement. And so surely, all darknet vendors are following these to an absolute T, right? Yeah, if that was the case, I wouldn't be up here. So we understand now at a high level how PGP works. We got a quick idea of some of these best practices. So let's get into the case study and see how many of these vendors are actually following these best practices. So this project started around 2023. From that point up until about last year, I was basically just trolling darknet markets, grabbing up vendor public keys and kind of treating them like they were Pokemon cards. All with the intent of eventually one day doing some sort of mass analysis against all of these keys. Now overall, I created covert accounts on the 10 darknet markets that you see here. I also want to call out that a lot of these are no longer even available anymore. We had a couple of them that are down, and then there's actually quite a few. I know Nemesis, and I think Abacus also were seized by law enforcement. And so as I'm searching across these different markets, I'm looking for vendors specifically involved in digital items. So think malware, hacking services, cracked software, things like that. I'm not really interested so much in vendors that are selling physical items only. There's other methods we can use to kind of identify those. If you go with the law enforcement route, you can use controlled purchase, controlled delivery, exploit the package tracking process, things like that. So I'm more interested in these digital vendors. During this time, I was also making probably a foolish assumption that vendors that are dealing in these more tech-savvy types of crimes, that surely they would have a little bit better OPSEC than just some regular guy out here who's selling drugs. So in total, I went through 710 different vendor profiles across these 10 darknet markets, and all of them but 5 actually made their public key available on their vendor profile. So what I mentioned earlier, that you're going to be tripping over these things, this is exactly what I'm talking about. These things are super easy to find. And so what do you do when you find a couple hundred PGP keys? Well, you don't want to go through these manually. That's going to take way too long. You don't know how many of these are actually solid targets versus just ones that are completely blank on the inside, right? And so I want to isolate those that I believe are going to be the easiest for me to unmask that vendor based on the contents of their PGP key. And so, like I said, I don't want to manually go through all of these 700 and something odd keys. And so I'm going to use a little bit of automation to make this a little bit easier. So the first thing I'm going to do, I want to get a hash of the file contents. I want to be able to use some link analysis tools, and I want to determine which of these vendor profiles have the same exact public key. Next thing we're going to do is some kind of pattern matching. So I'm going to use the GPG list package command, and then I'm going to use our file, and then we're going to use grep to isolate the user ID packet. So if a vendor put an email address in when they made their PGP key pair, this is where that information is actually going to be stored. We can then use more pattern matching, in this case regex, to figure out which of those user ID packet strings actually contain a format which resembles an email address. And now, at this point, we could probably call it quits here and kind of start seeing what we have, but we're going to take it a little bit further because we want to rule out some potential false positives. Now to do this, we're going to isolate the email domain, and we're going to see if that email domain has any registration information by querying whoisdata. And the reason we're going to do this is going to help us remove those edge cases where, say, the user entered what looks like an email address, right? It matches our regex pattern, but where they just kind of put something in and it's not a real email address with an actual registered domain. We're then going to run all the emails that came back with the whois information through have I been pwned. We're going to see how many of these emails actually appeared in a past data breach. The idea behind this is we're trying to filter down to those high value targets. I want to see how many of these emails were used on other platforms and not only used to make the PGP key pair. And so finally, the emails that contain a domain that has whois registration information, where that email was present in one or more data breach, those are your high value targets. Those are the ones that you're going to be most likely to identify that vendor based on the contents of their PGP public key. So after the script finishes up, the first thing we're going to look at is the actual overlap of those public keys. Now remember, we want to see if they're following these best practices. In this case, are they making a unique public key for all of their vendor profiles? Now, overall, yes. For the vast majority of these vendors that I looked at, they did have a unique public key on their vendor profile. However, there was about 30% of them that actually contained a public key that was also found on one or more other vendor profiles. So out of the 705 profiles we started off with, those that actually had a public key, that filters down to only 479 unique public keys. And so it wasn't uncommon to see the same public key across maybe 2 or even 3 different vendor profiles. But as you can see, we also saw a couple examples where it was found on as many as 6 or even 7 different vendor profiles overall. And so this is a simplified version of what those connections look like. I found it was kind of interesting that the one in the bottom left there, Quantum Marketplace, was the only market that didn't have any vendor that reused the same public key as any of the other vendors. Now, to be fair, this one also had the least number of profiles, only 27 in total, and so this might be more indicative of our sample size versus the actual OPSEC practices of those particular vendors. Now, if we start layering in that email address information that we extracted earlier, well, there's a lot more overlap, isn't there? And so, while yes, the vast majority of these vendors are using a unique public key, a good bit of them kind of botched it because they used a unique public key, spent all the time generating a new key, and well, they just put the same email address in as they did the other ones. And so you take that one extra pivot, and then you can actually start linking together a lot of these vendor profiles that still used a unique public key. So speaking of email addresses, so out of the 479 unique public keys, 218 of them contained an email address that had actual WHOIS registration information. So these are expected to be real domains. Now this means just under half of those didn't follow that other best practice of leave it blank. Don't put an email here in the first place. So we got the top 7 most common email domains that I found at the top, and then under that break line, we got 3 that are less common, but ones I considered worth mentioning. So first thing you'll probably notice, there's a lot of ClearNet emails here, right? Gmail's the top 1, and quite frankly, it's not even close. We got a couple of vendors that use some encrypted options, so we see some Hotmail. We see some Proton Mail, some RiseUp, but honestly, those aren't nearly as high up on that list as I kind of would have expected. For me though, I think probably the most surprising result out of this is we got this one guy down there at the bottom who was apparently running his entire darknet enterprise using those America Online free trial CDs. Now, taking those 218 emails that had the active WHOIS information, we only had 61 that actually appeared in a past data breach. And so in the end, this is what we end up with for high value targets, 61. So if we think back about those OPSEC best practices again, this clearly goes against the big one, right? Don't reuse an email that you're using for personal use elsewhere. Same as the last slide, top 10 at the top, or top 7 at the top, break line, 3 at the bottom, less common, but ones I consider to be worth mentioning. So the more notable data breaches we have here, social media sites, MySpace, LinkedIn, Twitter. And basically what this means is these darknet vendors use the same exact email address to sign up for these social media platforms as they then use to go on and make their PGP key pair. And so this in and of itself is definitely bad from an OPSEC perspective, but there's actually 3 other breaches in this list that are even more concerning for our particular vendors. So first off, we got Neopets, which honestly, it kind of baffles me that not 1, not 2, but 7 different darknet vendors reuse the same email address that they use to sign up for Neopets. Now the main thing I want to call out about this one is the actual time of the breach. So this occurred all the way back in 2013. So why is this relevant? Well, if you've been using the same email address for that amount of time, you're now a high value target. You've been using the same email address for 10 years, I expect there to be a lot more additional information floating around the internet on that particular email address. And now we got the verifications.io breach. So of all the data breaches that I saw for these different vendors, this one is probably the worst, and it really highlights those risks of reusing that personal email to then go on and make your vendor PGP key pair. So what does this breach include? Well, full names, date of births, phone numbers, physical addresses. From an investigator's perspective, this is the holy grail for identifying somebody. This is basically a fast track to attribution for those 18 vendors that were caught up in this data breach. And the last one, which is my personal favorite, the Police One breach. So this is also an older breach. The data included, not quite as concerning as what we saw in the last one, but what you want to know about this breach is the origin. So this breach involved the Police One forums, which you could probably guess is a forum for law enforcement professionals. And so I'm not going to say that everyone on that forum was law enforcement. However, we know that that's in their targeted user base, right? And given how egregious of a mistake this kind of thing is, I don't believe this is an actual darknet vendor. I think instead, it's probably more likely that we have a couple local police agencies that probably need to do a little bit better on their undercover operations. And so the last few slides, we got a real high-level view of those PGP creation habits. I also want to take some time now to talk about some of these high-value targets. Now, keep in mind, I'm not going to be unmasking anybody fully. I'm going to have a lot of this will be redacted. The main thing I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to show you some interesting pivots or data sets that were used in order to go from a vendor's PGP public key to eventually identifying a real-world person of interest. So first vendor we got here, I initially looked at them through their hacker for hire listing. Though, as you can tell, they kind of dabble in a little bit of everything. We can see they got some bank fraud, some credit card fraud, and a bunch of different kinds of drugs. Now, the reason I keyed in on this guy is his profile kind of gave me some scam vibes. I know it's kind of a diagram for ants in the back, but basically if you can't read this, a couple things that stand out. One is they have a bunch of products that are not related, and they all have the same price. So that's the first key. The other thing is, this is a vendor that doesn't specialize in any particular kind of product. Typically, you're going to have sort of one or two specialties. You're not going to have this kind of wide net. So he's trying to catch as many people as he can, in this case victims, and try and entice them to reach out and try and buy something. So as was common with a lot of the vendors I looked at, he gave a Gmail account when he made his PGP key pair. And honestly, this email was in quite a few data breaches, but that didn't really matter because this guy just spammed his products all across the ClearNet as well. So we're talking pages and pages and pages and pages of Google results. Now, this guy advertised his stuff pretty much anywhere you can think of. So I found him on social media sites. I found him on DeviantArt, gun selling sites, even some furry forums. And so pretty much at the end of all these posts, without fail, he would always include the same email address that we found in his vendor's public key, as well as a variety of usernames and email addresses and phone numbers. Now, the phone numbers and the usernames, those were all dead ends. Got nothing out of those. However, he did have some domains that he included, which did include some registration information. Unfortunately, that was also a dead end. 2 first names, who would have guessed it? And so these also came back to a new Gmail email address that I did not have yet. Also a dead end. And so none of this really led me anywhere. And so what I did is I went back to the vendor's PGP key, that initial email address that I extracted, and did he register any domains using this one? And he did. A couple years prior, he actually registered another domain. Now, unlike all the other ones that we saw, this one actually suggests that the vendor is based out of Cameroon. Now, the Google email from the actor's public key also appeared in multiple ripoff reports as well. So those scam vibes ended up coming out to be true. So we have multiple users who actually reported this particular vendor for ripping them off. Now, it's not clear if this is from, maybe some of the darknet stuff that he was doing, or if it was one of the many ads he had from the ClearNet. Now, the best part about this is we actually don't have to look any further to identify our vendor, because they did it for us. So they actually uploaded, a couple of the different victims uploaded correspondence that they had with this vendor. So when it gets time to pay, well, who are you going to make the money order out to? And so in this case, the vendor provided the same name for the same individual in the same city in Cameroon to multiple individuals and instructed them to make the money order out to them. Now, obviously, they do this, they send the money off, no product arrives, so what do? Well, they dox the guy in retaliation. And so quick searching on this name did confirm that it is in fact a real individual located in that specific city in Cameroon. So this ends up being our person of interest in this particular case. So recap with our pivot chart. That vendor's email, we took a little bit of the scenic route. We went through those forum posts, the social media sites, but we didn't really get anything there other than that one domain that, once again, was registered in Cameroon. Now, realistically, we could have just pivoted directly off of that email into those rip-off reports if we didn't want to take the scenic route, and that immediately gives us a person of interest, also based in Cameroon. I want to point out before I move on that although we do have a person of interest here, we cannot say with high confidence that this is actually our vendor. This could very well be a money mule who's just collecting the money on our vendor's behalf. And so next up we have another vendor which really highlights what happens when you don't take a screenshot when you need it. So anytime you see something that's of value, make sure you screenshot it first. So by the time I identified this guy was a high value target, I go to start taking my screenshots, and well, law enforcement had seized Nemesis Market by this point, so no screenshot for this guy. What I can share about this vendor though is that they dealt in fake identity documents, and like our last vendor, they also provided a Gmail account for their PGP key pair. Now, unlike the last vendor, this guy did a really good job to not spam his email all across the wider internet. And so I came up pretty much empty with most of my usual kind of pivots and tools here. My only real break in this particular case came when I located this document on a platform called Scribed that showed someone using that vendor's email address had signed up for unemployment benefits during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this application was subsequently denied, and the reason they gave for that denial was, well, lack of proper identification. Keep in mind, this vendor, he's involved in fake identity documents, right? And so as I'm looking at this application, there's a lot of things that just did not match up. The name, the email address, the phone numbers, it didn't really jive. And so everything on this application kind of suggested this was likely a fraudulent application that was made on someone else's behalf in order to try and get these unemployment benefits. The real question then is, why would our vendor upload such an incriminating document to a public platform? Well, if you've never used Scribe before, this is how it works. If you want to download documents from somebody else, you got to upload your own documents first. And so if our vendor had, they exceeded their free trial, they found something on that platform they wanted to download, well, they got to download something they own first. Probably would have picked something else, but now if that's the case, then this means that per those instructions up top, our vendor would have had to upload at least 4 other documents. Well, we actually uploaded a lot more than that. So you get a really good inside view into the type of vendor that this guy is, some of the documents he's dealing with. So we got various types of bank statements, credit card statements, some government docs, a lot of things that looked like he was editing and then trying to make some blank forms for, and then using to make his own fraudulent ones. We also found at least one document he uploaded that included files containing full names, full date of birth, as well as full social security numbers. They also uploaded examples of a bunch of different government identity documents, specifically those from the United States. And they also had some Photoshop tutorials, which would probably be useful to somebody who's kind of learning how to do this on the fly. Now, among all these docs, we also see some other documents that they uploaded, which didn't really fit this overall scheme. So this included some study guides for examinations, specifically out of Nigeria, as well as some other Nigerian documents which didn't show the same signs that they were being edited and kind of used as templates, like the ones we saw from the United States. And so this is nice, right? We get a potential country of interest now at this point, but we don't have our person of interest yet. So another fun fact about Scribe, they don't scrub metadata. So unlike all these other social media sites, everything that you put in there when you upload this doc, it stays. Now, in all fairness, this vendor did a really good job to scrub most of the files they had uploaded, but I'd say out of the roughly 40 documents or so that he had added, one of them actually had metadata of investigative value. So we can see the file creation time, the spreadsheet software, maybe get an idea of like a potential time zone he's in, but the real win here comes from the author's name. Now in this case, it wasn't a real name, however, it was a very unique username. So when I say unique username, it only really appeared in two places. One being a user profile on a Nigerian English language forum, and the other one being a profile on Facebook. And so we have a Facebook profile for a user who's using the same exact username as the one we found in that one document. I feel like digital creator and financial advisor are probably a little bit on the nose for a cover story, but I guess it matches up. So in the end, this one also was pretty minimal effort, right, to get from that public key to eventually identifying a real-world identity. A couple more pivots than the last one, but still pretty minimal effort. So from the email, we extracted that vendor's public key, or flip it. From the vendor's public key, we extracted that email address. That led us to the unemployment doc. The unemployment doc gave us the vendor scribed account. Once we got to the scribed account, we see all those different profiles, or all those different files that they had uploaded. We get all the ones that are kind of suggesting a Nigerian nexus. We also have that one that they did not scrub the metadata on. That metadata, like I said, it was a very unique username, only came back to two places, one being a Nigerian English language forum, and the other one being a Facebook profile, which gives us our person of interest located out of Nigeria. Now the last vendor we're going to look at, this one was my particular favorite. This guy specializes in selling different ripped content for a bunch of adult video platforms. Now this guy actually had two separate public keys. The most recent public key actually had a fake email address in it, so kudos to him for that. However, he also had an older key, and in that key he had a Hotmail email address. And so if you're wondering, how do we link these together, right? They got unique public keys, they got a unique email address. Well, he just had the same username and the same branding across all of his different profiles, all different markets. So like I said, you don't have to have the public key to link these people together. Now to make matters worse, for this particular vendor, the email address he included had a very unique username, which also included a full and pretty unique real name as well. Now pivoting off that username, we found multiple sites where the guy used the same username. His full name, couple numbers, pretty unique. This included a Pinterest account, which of interest only contained pins in the Portuguese language. And as you could probably expect, there was a lot of different profiles on these different adult websites. So Fansly, Pornhub, a bunch of different message boards. And so on one of these message boards, this guy is advertising, he's selling ripped OnlyFans content, specifically for Brazilian users. So if we marry that back up with what we saw from Pinterest, we start getting an idea of a potential country of interest here, right? Guy might be in Brazil. This vendor was also present in multiple data breaches, going as far back as 2013. And so it's actually, got a lot of history on this particular email address, right? It's actually their presence, though, in multiple info stealer logs that really caught my attention, not so much the data breaches. Now, thanks to Hudson Rock, we can see that this vendor was compromised by the Azarel info stealer. And although Hudson Rock does redact much of their entries, if you already know a little bit about your target, this is a gold mine for new information. So this example we have here, it shows me that the vendor also has a Gmail account with the same exact number of characters and the same first character as that Hotmail email that I extracted from their PGP key pair. So they're likely using the same exact username on Gmail that they're using on Hotmail. Now, knowing the vendor's darknet username, I can also make a really good guess on those last two email addresses, which also follow the exact same pattern. And so now we have 3 new email addresses that we can start pivoting off of. And if you're curious how the vendor got infected, well, he was apparently getting high on his own supply. So before he got infected, there was a bunch of Azarel info stealer campaigns that were specifically using porn and dating sites in order to help spread this infection. So seeing that this vendor was using the same usernames on all these different email addresses, I decided to do some additional enumeration, and I identified yet another email, this time on Yahoo. Same username that they had used in their the email in their vendor's public key. Now this Yahoo email led me to a Facebook page, and the vendor was smart enough at least not to follow their Facebook page, but this page only had about half a dozen followers on it, all of which were in Brazil. And so we start going through these lists of followers. Of course, all their friends lists are open, and guess what? They have a mutual friend in common. That mutual friend, same name, same username, and is also located in Brazil. And so this is what gives us our person of interest. So quick recap once again on the pivot chart. We started off with those two public keys linked together by the username. That first one, obviously it's a dead end, doesn't lead us anywhere, it's a fake email address. That second one though, that gives us the Hotmail email address. Now realistically, I kind of took you all on the scenic route. I went straight from that Hotmail email address to that username, and that was my person of interest initially. Because like I said, that username, very unique, came back to one individual. That real name, pretty unique, came back to one individual. But if we want to shore up our attribution, we can take the scenic route, we can go back, look at those forum posts, those social media sites, we get additional information that does corroborate, yeah, this guy's likely in Brazil. We can also look at the info stealer logs. Using those context clues, we're able to see that they're using the same email address, or at least the same username on these different email platforms. We do additional enumeration, we get that Yahoo email. Yahoo email's tied to the Facebook page. Facebook page has a couple followers, all in Brazil, and those followers have a mutual friend in common which has the same name and the same username as the person of interest to be identified previously. And so that's as far as we got on the actual case studies. Hopefully by this point you have a little bit of a better idea of if you do see a couple PGP keys, how do you filter them down into ones that are high value, and then how do you actually pivot off of them to maybe identify a real world person of interest. Before we open up for questions, I do want to touch on a couple things really quick. The first thing, the main takeaway I want you to have out of this is that PGP keys are a very readily available data point if you're trying to unmask darknet vendors. These things are super common. Like I said, you're going to be tripping over them, and they're not something you need to be overlooking if you're trying to do some initial reconnaissance on a vendor. Thankfully for us as investigators, these vendors still engage in some pretty risky PGP key pair creation habits. That's rough. So this means that not only are these public keys something that are commonly available, but they also have the real opportunity to provide you with some really solid real-world attribution information as well. And then finally, OPSEC's hard, right? I'm always surprised on how many people come up to me and they basically just say that darknet targets, they're completely untouchable. You can't do anything about them. And that's simply not the case. Tor and encryption, they're not going to do you any good if you're just going to broadcast your personal email address with your real name out to the world. And so I want you to understand then that darknet vendors are just as susceptible to OPSEC failures as any of the rest of us. And so you need to look for these kind of opportunities and then use them to your advantage, and then hopefully you can pivot off of them. And that's all I got. Do they have a mic for you all?